The era of global communism came to an end towards the end of the 20th century, and this happened a lot faster and a lot more peacefully than anybody would have anticipated. In China, the death of Mao in 1976 led to nearly immediate changes in the country. Over the next few years, the Communist Party abandoned basically all of Mao's ideas, but the party in power kept ruling under the name of the Communist Party. In 1989, a series of mass movements in Eastern Europe overthrew governments one after another, and finally, in 1991, communism in the Soviet Union comes to an end, the same place where it started in 1917. Communism as a global experiment had failed, but any discussion of communism as an economic system also has to take into consideration that neither of the countries, Russia or China, were ready for communism, at least according to the ideas of Karl Marx. But we're not really concerned here with the theoretical base of communism and whether it's a viable system. What's important is that the brand of communism that was practiced by the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China failed in the 20th century. And communism in practice was a failure both economically and morally. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union and China were not catching up with Western countries. They started far behind, but the goal of things like Stalin's 5-year plans and Mao's Great Leap Forward were to give these countries the same industrial capabilities as Western countries. This didn't happen. In the Soviet Union, people were becoming poorer and poorer. People were forced to stand in long lines to get food and just other bare essentials. And this was extremely demoralizing and embarrassing for the Soviet Union. The Soviets before had been bragging about how they'd found a better way to wealth than capitalism. And it becomes clear that their model definitely isn't working. The second was a moral failure. So Stalin's purges and his forced labor camps, Mao's Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge wages a genocide against its own people. All throughout this, one of communism's great appeals had been the idea of moral superiority. Communism as being morally superior to capitalism, and in theory, absolutely it is, but in practice, that's not the way it played out. So both China and the Soviet Union ended communism, but they took different routes to do this. In China, we see the end of communism, but at the same time, ironically, maintaining the Communist Party. After a few transitional leaders, we see Deng Xiaoping emerge as the leader of post-Mao China. Deng's main interest was economic growth. Deng wanted to move the Chinese people away from Maoism, and he's very critical of Mao following Mao's death. He opened up a lot and told the Chinese people about the suffering caused by the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, but at the same time, still holding Mao up as the hero of the Chinese people. Mao was the revolutionary hero that liberated China from Japanese oppression, from American oppression, from British oppression, as well as the brutal Kuomintang. So, in that sense, Mao was still regarded as a hero in the Communist Party. But after Mao's death, 100,000 political prisoners were released. High-ranking members of the Communist Party were arrested during the Cultural Revolution, got their jobs back. And Deng opened the country up to world trade and foreign investment. Deng got rid of collectivized farming, brought the country back to small-scale private agriculture, and really opened China up to the world economy. And first, he welcomed foreign investment in what are known as special enterprise zones on the Pacific coast. Deng's reforms led to rapid economic growth, the most rapid growth in world history, and this brought new prosperity for millions and millions of Chinese people. The standard of living in China rose dramatically. Chinese people had better diets, lower mortality rates, less poverty. Chinese cities were growing, their exports were growing. It was much improved material life. But on the other hand, there's massive corruption among Chinese officials. There were inequalities between rich and poor, inequality between the coast, where foreign investment was allowed, and the interior. There was overcrowding in cities, and there was terrible, terrible pollution in big cities. urban vices that disappeared with communism, things like organized crime, drug addiction, street crime, criminal underworld, all of these came back in full force. So China managed to turn itself into a largely capitalist economy with the Communist Party in charge. And all of Mao's worst fears really came true. So China today, still the Communist Party that's in charge, but they abandoned communist economic policies a long time ago. What they weren't willing to do was abandon political control of the country. A movement calling for democracy in China emerged in the late 1980s. This movement was led by university students. So university students calling for democratic reform. So students calling for democratic reform met in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And Deng Xiaoping ordered the brutal put down of the movement. So that was really the last mass democracy movement in China. So now today, China's a rapidly growing economic power with a capitalist economy ruled by a one-party dictatorship calling itself the Communist Party. The Soviet Union was less successful at maintaining control after the collapse of communism. So communism in the Soviet Union was falling apart, the country was poor, and a reform movement emerged within the Communist Party to address the party's problems. The leader of the reform movement was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he played a similar role in the Soviet Union as Deng played in China. He wanted to address the state's problems even if it meant reforming communism. In 1987, Gorbachev put forward an economic plan known as Perestroika, and this had a lot of similarities to what Deng was doing in China, shifting from collectivized agriculture to private farming, giving enterprises more freedom from government regulation. Gorbachev's next major policy shift was known as Glasnost, which means openness, and this represented a cultural and intellectual freedom in Soviet Union. It was really an effort to overcome the distrust that had really sprung up between the state and the people. So public media, newspapers, radio, television, they all became much more open. And this was like a huge awakening for the Russian people. And these are people for their entire lives, they were told that all social evils were the fault of the capitalist world, whether it be crime or prostitution or child abuse or suicide or corruption. All of these things were the fault of capitalism. Now, they were, in a lot of ways, they were hearing the truth for the first time. Stalin was reevaluated by the party, mass graves were discovered, and the party was very critical of Stalin, more than the Chinese were of Mao. Books that had been banned began to reappear. This included religious texts like the Bible and the Quran. And as these reforms were happening in the Soviet Union, regime after regime fell in Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev refused to get Russia involved with these regimes. So Gorbachev initiated all the reforms with the hope of strengthening and maintaining communism, but it ended up doing was leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The movement towards freedom made people demand things that went beyond what Gorbachev had intended. So there's a big democracy movement, there's new political parties springing up, calls for a multi-party democracy, and calls for a capitalist economy in the Soviet Union. And nationalist movements spring up all over the Soviet Union, people demanding independence from the Soviet Union. In 1989, 2 million people living in the Baltic republics joined hands and formed a 600-kilometer human chain demanding independence from the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev, to his credit, refused to use force to crush these protests. So we end up having independent Baltic republics like Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. And this is the background of what's known in Eastern Europe as the Miracle Year of 1989. There were mass demonstrations and the toppling of Soviet-backed communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania. We have the fall of the Berlin Wall that divided East and West Germany, and all of this gave a lot of confidence to reformers in the Soviet Union. If communism could be overthrown in Eastern Europe, then why couldn't it be overthrown in the Soviet Union? For Soviet patriots, the fact that Gorbachev didn't intervene in the overthrow of all these Eastern European governments and Soviet satellite states, it was an outrage. These were seen as Soviet Union's World War II gains. The Russia had paid for these with millions and millions of Russian lives, and now they're just being allowed to slip away. So there's this short-lived counter-revolution. Gorbachev was put under house arrest. The Soviet military brought tanks into Moscow to put down all the demands for democracy. But this counter-revolution was met with popular resistance from the people, and if anything, it just made the people more adamant that the Soviet Union needed to end. And it would. So, in 1991, the largest state, the last great world empire, collapsed. The first communist party ever died. Communism was discredited. The 45-year Cold War between the East and West was over. Capitalism and democracy had won out over socialism and authoritarian governments. By the year 2000, the communist world had shrunk significantly. The Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, communism is gone. China, as well as Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, remain officially communist, but all have really capitalist economies or pursued Western reforms. Cuba has allowed small business and tourism to grow, while still harshly putting down any opposition to communist rule. But just recently, a few years ago, Fidel Castro hands power over to his brother because he's getting sick, he's getting very old, so it's going to be interesting.